Hey all, Smash again. I'm not doing the whole chair video thing this time because it's kind of needless setup for me talking about something, and then I have to de-set up a tripod and reset it up elsewhere so I can set up this and set up and setting up. So anyway, I'm doing one more video for tonight, and then I'm going to watch Delicious Fist of the North Star. This time I'm going to be talking about triggers. Specifically, when to use what, why some things are better than others at different times, etc., etc., etc. Triggers are what really makes Vanguard Vanguard. Well, triggers are basically, for those who might not know, there's probably not many of you, but I may as well address it anyway. In Vanguard, you have your Vanguard, who is meant to be you. Whenever your Vanguard attacks or takes damage, you take the top card of your deck and you move it to the trigger zone. If it has one of these four icons in the corners, this one being heal, this one being draw, this one being stand, and this one being critical, this is a trigger. When it is moved to the trigger zone, either by your Vanguard's attack or when you take damage, a trigger activates. It both gives plus 5,000 power to one of your units on the field of your choice, and has an additional effect. The four effects are stand. You may stand one of your rested units, whether defensive or offensive. The only real time that defensive matters, however, is if you're playing against an opponent who uses a Mega Colony deck. Draw, which is you draw a card. Awesome, right? Critical is you increase the critical value of one of your units by 1. This really doesn't do anything on defensive. And heal, which is if while this card is in the trigger zone, so before it's moved to damage or to hand, you have the same amount of damage or more than your opponent, you may take one of your damage and move it to drop zone. That means if I am at 3 damage and my opponent is at 4 damage and he hits me and I hit a heal trigger, that heal trigger is still in the trigger zone when it is checked and when the trigger is activated. So I only have 3 damage at the time to my opponent's 4, and the trigger does not go off, even though after it moves to the damage zone, we have the same amount of damage. Needlessly nitpicky. Anyway, generally a trigger kind of your trigger layout in a deck. By the way, you can only run 16 triggers total. You have to run 16, and you can only have 4 or fewer heal triggers. You can't run 5, even if your clan has more than one different kind of heal trigger. Anyway, generally your trigger layout in a deck kind of tells you how the deck is played. Almost every deck in the game will run 4 heal triggers. So I used to run with just 3 because I thought it was kind of funny, and it worked okay, but 4 is just better. The only time you wouldn't want to run 4 heal triggers is if you're looking to run a deck that's going to win before you've taken 6 damage. Super beat down fast decks. Like if you were playing some kind of hybrid, like Kagero Spike Brothers with 16 crit, then you wouldn't run any heal triggers. Or if you're running a super stand heavy Nova Grappler deck with 16 stand triggers, then you wouldn't run any heal. Generally though, heal is something that you want to run. Next, draw triggers. If you have a deck that plays a lot of cards that then remove themselves from the field. For example, Kimnara is a Kagero grade 1 that says you may counterblast 1 and move this unit to soul to retire one of your opponent's grade 1 rear guards. Or Majesty Lord Blaster. Not even that. If your deck doesn't have much hard draw abilities like Maiden of Libra, who is if it hits you can counterblast 2 to draw a card. If you don't have many abilities that will draw you cards, heal triggers draw triggers are a good idea. And if your deck plays a lot of cards from hand to field which don't stay on the field, like above mentioned Kagero, you'll generally want to run draw triggers. Draw triggers used to be pretty rare. A lot of people just ran all crit and a little bit of draw. Or people used to basically run as much crit as possible, then fill the rest in with stand. Now people are playing a lot more draw triggers. Like in the tournament deck list posted by Bushiroad recently, every single deck ran at least 4 draw, which should say something. A lot of decks ran 5 draw, and for that reason 5 draw might be mathed out to be the best amount of draw if you have a deck with no actual hard draw. Because one thing to note about hard draw triggers is that while they're a trigger, they only have 5,000 guard, while every other trigger has 10,000. This is because if you are running 12 non-draw triggers and 4 draw triggers and 25 units in your deck that have a 5k guard, which is grade 1s and 2s, a card in your deck is worth, on average, 5,000 guard. So if you hit a draw trigger, on average you'll draw 5,000 guard, which means the draw trigger plus the card it's making you draw is worth the same as a normal trigger. Note that it could be more, obviously, because you could draw a crit or a stand or a heal trigger. Or it could be less, you could draw a grade 3. But on average it's worth 5,000. So a draw is generally worth about the same shield as the rest of the stuff if you take into account the shield of the unit you draw with it. But draw triggers only work with drive checks. So as a general rule of thumb, the more ways that your deck draws cards without drive checking them, because generally a deck only draws cards one way, when you draw a card at the start of your turn, or if you hit a draw trigger. Those are the only 2 ways that your deck can draw, 4 draw triggers is probably a really good idea. If you have other abilities, such as Skull Witch Nevin, who is a Shadow Paladin grade 2 that says when this is played to a rearguard circle, you can counterblast 1, discard a Shadow Paladin, and draw 2 cards. Or the above-mentioned Maiden of Libra, or anything of that sort. Anything that draws you a card, not drive checks. You probably want to run less draw, because you have a higher chance of drawing a draw trigger instead of drive checking a draw trigger, and that's the only time a draw trigger is a bad thing. Another thing to note, and another reason why draw triggers are probably given weaker shield, is that they work whether they're on offense or defense. No, every other trigger has a situation where it doesn't do anything. Heal triggers don't do anything if you have less damage than your opponent. Crit triggers don't work on defense. Stand triggers really don't work on defense. Draw triggers always draw you a card, and so because of that, they're more valuable in that you can use them. They're good when you take damage. They can even save you the game more so than any other trigger because you draw a card from it, and that card could be the difference between victory and defeat. That's draw triggers. Personally, I'm a big fan of them. I run 4 of them in most of my decks. Some decks I run more. I'm a big fan of 6 draw. Because then it looks like I might be running 8, because generally you run different kinds of triggers. No matter how many you run, you generally want to run multiple different kinds of triggers of the same type, so that way your opponent can't just see, oh, this person has only used TARs, he must only be running one type of crit trigger. If I have 4 crit in Kagero, I'll run 2 Blu-ray Draco Kid, a TAR, and a Raksha, I think the name is, of the grade 0 3000 crit trigger. So that way I'll have 3 different kinds of crit triggers, but only 4 different crit triggers. So my opponent can't see exactly how many, and it may look like I'm running a lot more. Anyway, draw triggers. Now this is a big paradigm in how your deck attacks. Crit versus stand. The general rule of thumb is, if you have rear guards who can attack for 12,000 or higher, unboosted, you want to run some stand. Otherwise, you want to run more crit. The reason for this is that if I'm attacking someone and they see that I've only got 9,000 rear guards out in the field, they will guard for just enough that one trigger will go through. Thus, if my Vanguard drive checks a stand trigger, I have to give the power to my Vanguard, otherwise the attack won't hit. But when I stand a rear guard, it won't do anything, because that rear guard doesn't have the power to hit their Vanguard, or even other cards in the field. So generally, if you run things that'll hit 11, or even 12, or even 11,000, things like Genocide Jack, Brutal Jack, excuse me, in the English version, or the Tachikaze 11k grade 2, or even grade 3s that are played to rear guard, like I wouldn't say Skydiver, because they don't even have stand triggers, yet. Or things like Dragonic Overlord. Those kinds of things that can hit a Vanguard without being boosted and without having power passed to them. If you run a lot of those in your deck, you'd want to run stand. For example, I am kind of crazy, but in my Majesty Lord Blaster deck, I run stand triggers, because I've got Knight of Loyalty Bedivere, who is a 12,000 attacker if I've got a Blaster Vanguard, and I've got Knight of Exploding Flames Baramides, who's a 13k attacker, and I've got 4 copies of each of those. So I've got 8 cards in my deck that unboosted swing for 12 or 13, which is beautiful. And so because of that, I run stand, because then I can give the power to my Vanguard, who's Majesty Lord Blaster. If he hits, he's already hitting for way too much, so I don't really need the extra crit. And the stand works well with my other rear guards. You run crit, however, if this is not the case, or if you have a Vanguard that can stand itself, such as Stern Blaukruger or Dragonic Overlord at the end. Because not only does this mean that that if they underguard and you hit a trigger and the attack goes through, if it's a crit trigger, they take an extra damage. And then when you stand, you still have that extra crit to be passed. And that's nasty. Alternatively, if you're playing a deck with really high power attacks, such as Dragonic Waterfall, who is a grade 3 Kagero with 2 abilities. He's a 10,000 power. When he attacks Vanguard, he gets plus 3,000, and when he attacks, you can discard a grade 3 Kagero from your hand to give him plus 10,000 power. So boosted by Bar, if you discard a grade 3, he swings for 31,000. That is not something that most units can guard. And so because of that, people either no guard and hope you don't hit triggers, or they'll use a null guard, and then it doesn't matter what triggers you flip. Those kinds of decks, along with Phantom Blaster Dragon, Phantom Blaster Overlord, where things swing for so high that it's going to hit, or that it's either going to be hard to guard, or they have to null guard it. You run crit because you want to make sure you take as much advantage as possible of your Vanguard's massive power and how hard it is to guard it. Because one of the things is that if your deck, most decks should run at least 2 crit. Like, seriously, 2 crit doesn't sound like it does much, but it actually does, because it scares your opponent. They see that you have crit, and because of this, they have to guard more cautiously. Because no guarding your Vanguard when you're at 4 damage could lose you the game. Decks that have no crit whatsoever can be very much counterplayed. If I'm at 4 damage and my opponent attacks with his Vanguard, I know that he's not going to be able to hit me for more than 1 damage, so I'll just no guard. It's an easy decision to make. So that's why you'd want to run each thing. Yeah. I don't know. One thing to note about triggers is that a lot of clans don't really have much trigger selection, because a lot of clans will come out with 4 triggers and 4 triggers only, and that's all they get. Sometimes this is never good, actually. I'm not even going to say that. But sometimes this really hinders clans. For example, Dark Regulars, the set that it came out, had no crit triggers. They had did they? They had 2 stand triggers, a heal trigger, and no, they did have 1 crit trigger. But they had more stand than crit, and what this meant is that their main Vanguard, Demon World Marquis Ammon, who swings for all of the power ever, really didn't have much of a threat for hitting more than 1 damage. That kind of hampered the deck, and it hampered the main playstyle. And though other playstyles evolved, such as using higher powered rearguards like the Grade 2 Ammon, it still kind of threw a wrench in their possible powers. A lot of clans, though, when they come out, will just run 1 of each trigger. And to be honest, if you aren't sure what trigger setup you want, that's probably the best thing you should do. Just run 1 of each. And if you find yourself going, man, I wish the stand trigger was a crit trigger, write that down. If every time you drive check offensively, not defensively, because defensively you always want draw triggers, basically. Every time you drive check offensively, tell yourself, what would I want this trigger to be? And write it down. And do this over the course of like 10, 20, 50, whatever, how many games. And then just look at what you've written down. If like 70% of the time you're like, man, I wish there was a crit trigger, then you're going to want to run more crit triggers. Likewise, if you never actually say, man, I wish this was a stand trigger, you're probably not going to want to run any stand triggers. This actually goes for a lot of things. Vanguard is about making your deck better, not building a good deck. It's a very good idea that if you don't know how a deck is right now, or if you don't know if these 2 cards work well in the deck, what you should do is you should take your deck and take 2 cards that you're not comfortable about, and take them. This is a horrible example because those are double sleeves, man. Hey Narakami, you're right here. Take your cards and say, I don't know if this card is good in my deck. Well, obviously this is my starting Vanguard, so it's a bad example. Bear with me. Turn it around in your sleeve and leave it in your deck like this. Now every time you draw this card, write down on a piece of paper what you want this card to be. Either be specific or be vague. Like, oh, I wish this was a grade 1. Oh, I wish this was Dragon Monk Gojo. Oh, I wish this was whatever. And again, do that over like 10 games. Find a friend who will just play a battery of games with you. Maybe they're even doing the same thing. You work on decks together. And then at the end, look at the list. If 9 times out of 10 you want a grade 2, decide what grade 2 it's going to be. If you write down more specific stuff, see, that way you have a good idea of what you wish this card would be. Because, you may think that this is better balanced, this, etc., this, that, etc. But you really have to play games and see the results for yourself to be able to decide that. You can't make a good deck in your first try. You always have to play the deck a bunch of times, look at where it doesn't do well, and be honest with yourself. Don't just say you got bad draws, because what if you switched those cards around? Oh, this is a really good card. Oh man, I keep drawing it when I don't want to. Well, maybe that's not as good of a card in your deck as you want to believe. Generally, I like to think that in Vanguard there are no bad cards. There are only decks which those cards don't fit, and maybe it's not the best. It doesn't fit in the best deck build, but the card still works. So never blame bad draws. Just think about your ratios. Think about what cards work well, what don't, and always experiment. If you don't know what the last two cards in your deck should be, just throw in random stuff and then go from there. You can't make a good deck on your first try. You should try. But don't be disappointed that your first attempt didn't work, and don't assume that your first attempt will. It is not going to work. I can tell you that now. Triggers are a big reason why that may not be such. I used to run this deck with stand triggers because of Dragonic Overlord the end. Because if you hit a stand trigger with the end, and the attack hits, you stand the guy behind him. When you Persona Blast, you're now swinging with a full front middle column again. That doesn't really work out that well, though, because then I'll attack someone, and they'll know I don't have any of the ends in hand because I don't have a hand, or because they've seen what I've been drive checking. I've been playing what's been hidden, and they're just not threatened. And crit works a lot better because even then when I do hit with a crit, it's not just another damage. It's 2, maybe 4 damage, and that's big. So, triggers. And also, don't be afraid of running less heal triggers. Again, you gotta try things out to find them out. Who knows? 3 heal triggers did work for me for quite a while, and it threw off my trigger ratio, which made people kind of confused as to how many of what and which I was running. And to be honest, how many times has a 6th damage heal trigger saved you? They don't even work unless you kind of have the playstyle of no guarding more than your opponent. I don't, so... Well, actually, I do. Anyway, that's triggers, and kind of card stuff in general. The advice on the deck building about how you can't make a good deck on your first try is something that I really want to emphasize again, and will probably come up in another video of mine. I'm probably going to be doing... I've done a lot of deck discussions recently, not enough like actual mechanics discussions, so I'm probably going to be doing more of those soon. Expect within the next couple of days, like, this is a good guide on how to build it. I'm going to try and put together a good guide on building your own deck, about how you're trying to find the strengths and weaknesses of your own deck and what kind of trigger setup to run. Basically, it's going to gloss over all of this, but I also want to go over different stages of guarding, like when a 5k guard is just as good as a 10k guard, why a 15 and a 5 is better than a 10 and a 10, things like that. Yeah, that's about it. Hope you enjoyed. Like, share, etc. Thanks a lot for watching.